The silence inside the armored vehicle was absolute, a hermetically sealed vacuum of wealth and isolation that usually comforted him. But as the sleek, obsidian Tesla rolled to a stop on the cracked pavement of Maple Street, Elon Musk felt the carefully constructed architecture of his life begin to tremble. He sat there for a long moment, the engine humming a soundless frequency, staring through tinted glass at a Victorian house that time seemed to have aggressively forgotten. It was a structure of fading yellow paint and rusted gutters, a stark, decaying relic of a past he had spent 2 decades sprinting away from with rockets and satellites. To the world, he was the techno-king, the architect of the future, a man who spoke of multi-planetary species and neural links with the confidence of a god. But here, in the shadow of the porch swing that still creaked in the autumn wind, he was just a man with shaking hands, terrified of what awaited him on the other side of a wooden door. His security detail had called this visit a catastrophic liability, a deviation from the mission that made no strategic sense. They were right, of course. Strategically, this was foolish. But existentially, it was the only thing that mattered. A text message received 3 days ago, a digital ghost from a woman he hadn't seen since they were penniless students, dreaming of the stars, had pierced through his armor. It was a summons that defied logic, pulling him back from the edge of the future to the unresolved gravity of his history. As he finally stepped out into the chill of the October air, the smell of damp earth and burning leaves assaulted his senses, instantly transporting him back to a time before the billions, before the fame, before the loneliness that success had disguised as freedom. He walked up the path, every step heavier than the last. He had faced congressional hearings, rocket failures, and the brink of bankruptcy without blinking. Yet, as he reached for the tarnished brass knocker, his heart hammered against his ribs with a violence that frightened him. He didn't know it yet, but the man who walked up those steps would not be the same man who walked back down them. He thought he was there to close a chapter on an old romance, to pay respects to a memory. He had no idea that the door was about to open onto a secret so profound, so devastatingly human, that it would render every achievement of his career instantly meaningless. He was prepared for tears. He was prepared for anger. He was not prepared for the pair of green eyes that were about to change his universe forever. We often convince ourselves that the accumulation of power is the ultimate antidote to regret, that if we build enough, achieve enough, and conquer enough, we can outrun the shadows of the choices we left behind. Elon stood on that porch, suspended in the cruel gap between the titan the world worshipped and the human being he had starved into silence. For 2 decades, his life had been a masterclass in forward momentum, a relentless trajectory toward Mars, toward sustainable energy, toward a future that existed only in his mind. He had become the architect of tomorrow, but in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own yesterday. The problem was not that he had forgotten Marina. The problem was that he had remembered her every single day. A quiet, persistent ache that no amount of applause or stock market valuations could anesthetize. She represented the timeline he had severed, the alternative universe where ambition didn't require the amputation of intimacy. The world saw a man who had solved the equations of electric propulsion and orbital mechanics. But standing before that weathered wood, Elon faced an equation he couldn't solve: the calculus of lost time. The silence of the house was heavy, pressing against him with the weight of 1,000 unshared breakfasts and uncelebrated birthdays. He realized with a sudden, suffocating clarity that his billions were merely a currency that held no value in this economy of emotion. He could buy islands, but he couldn't buy back the Tuesday afternoon in 2003 when he walked away from her to take a conference call that he could no longer even remember. This was the central conflict of his existence, the rotting foundation beneath the skyscrapers of his success. He had won the game of capitalism, but he was terrified he had lost the game of life. The solution, if one even existed, lay in the terrifying vulnerability of the present moment. It required him to dismantle the fortress of invulnerability he had constructed around his heart. The text message Marina had sent was not merely an invitation, it was a challenge. It was a demand to stop looking up at the stars long enough to look at the earth he had neglected. He knew that crossing this threshold would require a courage far greater than the bravery needed to launch a rocket. Launching a rocket is physics. It is predictable, calculable, and ultimately impersonal. But opening this door was an act of archaeology into his own soul, a willingness to excavate the ruins of a relationship he had destroyed in the name of greatness. He had to confront the possibility that his great work was actually a great distraction, a glittering monument built to hide the wreckage of his personal life. He raised his hand again, the movement heavy and deliberate, understanding that the solution to his pain wasn't in the future he was building, but in the past he was finally brave enough to face. We live in a culture that fetishizes the grind, a society that has convinced us that exhaustion is a status symbol and that sleep is a defect of character. We are indoctrinated with the dangerous lie that love is a distraction to be managed rather than a fuel to be cherished. Elon standing on that porch represents the cracking of this collective facade. He is the avatar of our shared delusion that we can trade the warmth of the present for the promise of a glorious future without eventually going bankrupt in the currency of the soul. We all have a porch we are afraid to stand on. We all have a phone call we are too cowardly to make. The tragedy unfolding on Maple Street isn't just the story of a billionaire. It is a mirror reflecting the quiet devastations in our own lives. We bury our most precious relationships under the sediment of our ambitions, promising ourselves that we will exhume them when we have finally made it. But often, by the time we reach the summit, the people we wanted to wave to from the top have long since walked away from the base of the mountain. We trade the tangible warmth of a human hand for the cold blue glow of a screen, convinced that we are building a legacy. But what is a legacy if there is no one left to share it with? This story acts as an interrogation of our own priorities, demanding that we pause the relentless forward motion of our days to confront the uncomfortable arithmetic of our choices. I want you to look at your own life with the same brutal honesty that Elon is forced to face in this moment. Strip away the professional justifications and the comfortable excuses. Have you ever sacrificed a person you loved for a career that did not love you back? Have you traded a relationship for a promotion or deep companionship for a paycheck? It is a simple question with a complicated, often painful answer. But I am asking you to be brave enough to admit it to yourself and to this community. Type yes or no in the comments right now. Let us see how many of us are walking around with ghosts we created ourselves. When the heavy oak door finally swung open, it didn't just reveal the interior of a house. It peeled back the skin of the present to reveal the raw, beating heart of the past. Marina stood there, framed by the soft amber light of the hallway, looking both entirely different and exactly the same as the image Elon had carried in the locket of his memory for 2 decades. The years had been kind but honest. Silver streaks now ran through her dark, chaotic curls like veins of precious metal and obsidian, and fine lines bracketed her eyes that were still that impossible, piercing shade of emerald green. She didn't smile. This wasn't a reunion for smiling. She simply stepped aside, a silent usher into a world he had forfeited the right to enter. As Elon crossed the threshold, the air inside the house hit him with a physical force. It smelled of cinnamon, turpentine, and old paper, the sensory signature of the life they used to dream of building together before he traded it for rocket fuel and lithium batteries. The house was a living museum of a warmth he had forgotten existed. The walls were cluttered with framed sketches, not of unsuspecting landscapes, but of complex mechanical structures, propulsion schematics, and orbital trajectories drawn with a wild, artistic hand. He paused by a canvas leaning against a coat rack, his eyes narrowing. It was a charcoal rendering of a Falcon Heavy booster, but drawn from an angle only an engineer with the soul of a poet could imagine. Marina saw him looking, and her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and threaded with a tremor she couldn't suppress. She told him to keep walking. They weren't going to the kitchen. They weren't sitting in the living room to make small talk about stock prices or electric trucks. She led him down a long hallway that seemed to stretch backward through time, the floorboards groaning under his Italian leather shoes, a sound that accused him of being an intruder in a sanctuary. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, spilling a sterile, blue-white light that clashed violently with the warm tones of the rest of the house. The sound of a rhythmic, mechanical hissing reached his ears, the unmistakable, terrifying cadence of a ventilator. Elon felt his stomach drop, a sensation far worse than any G-force he had ever experienced. He looked at Marina, a question forming on his lips that he was too afraid to voice, but she didn't look back. She pushed the door open and gestured for him to enter. The room was a jarring collision of 2 worlds. It had once been a sunroom with large bay windows overlooking the garden, but now it was a high-dependency medical unit. Monitors stacked on metal carts blinked with jagged green lines. IV poles stood like silent sentinels. Thick black cables snaked across the floor. And there, in the center of this machinery, lay a young woman. She was pale, her skin translucent against the stark white sheets, her dark hair fanned out across the pillow like a halo of ink. Elon took a step forward, his breath catching in a throat that had commanded boardrooms and launched revolutions. The resemblance was not just a suggestion. It was a biological fact screaming in the silence. She had his jawline, the sharp, angular architecture of his face that the cameras loved. But she had Marina's eyes wide, intelligent, and currently locked onto him with an intensity that could burn through steel. This was Stella. She was 25 years old. She was the daughter he had never known, the variable he had never accounted for in the grand equation of his life. Marina stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together, and began to speak the words that would dismantle him. She explained that Stella was a genius, a prodigy who had taught herself calculus by age 9 and aerodynamics by 12. She had graduated top of her class from MIT, had been recruited by NASA before she could even legally drink, and had spent her short, brilliant career working on deep space propulsion systems. She had worshipped him from afar, Marina said, her voice cracking. Stella had followed every launch, every failure, every triumph, analyzing his work not just as a fan, but as a peer. She had kept his secret because she didn't want to be a distraction, didn't want to be a headline. She wanted to be an engineer, but the universe, in its cruel and random chaotic nature, had dealt her a hand that no amount of intellect could outmaneuver. Marina named the condition a rare, aggressive form of neurodegenerative disease that attacked the motor neurons, slowly imprisoning the mind within a paralyzed body. It was a thief that stole movement, then speech, then breath. Stella could no longer walk. She could no longer speak. Her hands, which had once drafted blueprints for ion engines, now lay motionless on the sterile sheets. She was trapped in the diving bell of her own failing biology, a brilliant consciousness staring out through a cracked window. Elon stared at the daughter he had missed. He looked at the machines keeping her alive, the technology that was barely sufficient, primitive, compared to the visions in his head. A wave of impotence crashed over him. He was the richest man in the history of the species. He had billions of dollars at his disposal. He could crash markets with a sentence. But standing at the foot of that bed, he realized that his wealth was nothing more than paper and digital dust. He could not buy her a new nervous system. He could not negotiate with death. He moved to the side of the bed, his knees hitting the floor as he collapsed into the chair usually reserved for nurses. He reached out, his hand trembling uncontrollably, and covered her cold, still fingers with his own. He waited for her to pull away, to be angry, to hate him for the 20 years of absence. But she didn't. Instead, a computer screen mounted on an articulated arm above her face lit up. A camera was tracking the minute movements of her pupils. A synthesized voice, devoid of emotion but heavy with meaning, filled the room. It said 2 words. "Hi, Dad." Elon Musk wept. He didn't cry like a dignified statesman or a composed celebrity. He broke down with the ugly, heaving sobs of a man realizing he had spent a lifetime climbing the wrong mountain. He buried his face in the mattress, clutching the hand of the stranger who shared his DNA, apologizing to the hum of the ventilator. He apologized for the time, for the ego, for the blindness. But as the storm of grief began to subside, something else began to rise in its place. The engineer in him woke up. The problem solver who refused to accept impossible as an answer. He looked up, wiping his face with his sleeve, and looked into Stella's eyes. He saw the fire there. She wasn't asking for pity. She was bored. She was a pilot without a ship, an explorer trapped in a cage. He turned to Marina, his voice rough but steadying into the cadence of command. He asked about her cognitive function. Marina confirmed what he suspected. Stella's mind was untouched. In fact, it was sharper than ever, honed by the forced stillness. She spent her days solving theoretical physics problems in her head because she couldn't write them down. Elon nodded, a plan forming in the synaptic flash of his mind. He couldn't save her life, the biology was too far gone, the timeline too short. But he could save her living. He could break her out of this prison. Over the next 24 hours, the sleepy house on Maple Street was transformed into a forward operating base for the most advanced technology on Earth. Elon didn't send assistants. He made the calls himself. He summoned his best engineers from Neuralink and SpaceX, flying them in on private jets with crates of prototype equipment that the public wouldn't see for another decade. They weren't there to cure the disease. They were there to hack the interface between Stella and the world. They installed a localized, high-bandwidth satellite link directly to the house, bypassing the local grid to provide speed faster than the Pentagon's. They replaced her standard eye-tracking communication device with a prototype neural interface, a non-invasive headset that could read the electrical intent of her motor cortex with near telepathic speed. But the centerpiece of the solution was the headset. It was a custom-modified virtual reality unit, stripped of its weight and counterbalanced on a zero-gravity arm so it could hover over Stella's face without touching her fragile skin. Elon sat by her bed as the technicians calibrated the system. He explained to her that he couldn't take her to the launch pad. He couldn't put her in a suit, but he could give her the data. He linked the headset directly to the raw, uncompressed feeds from his orbital satellites and the rovers currently traversing the Martian surface. When they lowered the visor over her eyes, the sterile room disappeared. The beeping of the monitors faded into the background. Suddenly, Stella was standing on the Chryse Planitia, the golden plains of Mars. The resolution was so high she could see the individual grains of iron oxide dust. She could look up and see the pale, small sun of a different world. And she wasn't alone. Elon donned a headset in the chair beside her, and his digital avatar appeared next to hers in the simulation. For the first time in her life, she was standing up. For the first time in 2 years, she could turn her head and look at her father, eye to eye, without the interference of gravity or disease. They didn't speak much of feelings in that digital landscape. They spoke the language they both loved. They spoke of drag coefficients and atmospheric density. They walked for hours across the virtual craters, Elon pointing out where the first colony ships would land, and Stella using the speed of the new interface, typing out corrections to his landing trajectories in real time, overlaying the virtual sky with equations that made Elon pause in genuine awe. She saw flaws in the fuel intake valves that his senior engineers had missed. She proposed a structural change to the Starship's fins that would increase stability by 4% during re-entry. It was the most profound connection of Elon's life. In the real world, he was holding the limp hand of a dying woman. But in the digital world, they were two titans of industry striding across the cosmos. Father and daughter, master and apprentice. They spent days like this. Elon canceled meetings with heads of state. He ignored the plummeting stock price caused by his disappearance. He slept on a cot in the corner of her medical room, waking up every few hours to check the monitors, terrified that if he closed his eyes for too long, the signal would be lost. Marina watched them from the doorway, her heart breaking and healing in the same beat. She saw the softness return to Elon's face, a vulnerability she hadn't seen since they were 22. She saw the light return to Stella's eyes, the fierce joy of agency, of being useful, of being heard. The solution wasn't a cure. It was connection. It was the realization that love is an action, not a sentiment. Elon began to read to her when the VR sessions became too tiring for her brain. He read her the technical manuals of the Apollo missions. He read her Asimov. He read her the poetry of T.S. Eliot. He bathed her with the help of the nurses, learning the terrifying fragility of the human body, overcoming his own squeamishness to care for the child he had abandoned. One evening, as a thunderstorm battered the old Victorian house, shaking the windowpanes, the power flickered. The VR system went dark. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Stella's heart rate monitor spiked a signal of distress. Elon was there instantly, leaning over her, panic rising in his chest. But the screen lit up with her words, typing slowly now as her fatigue set in. "I'm not scared," she wrote. "I just want to know if it's worth it." Elon stared at the words. "If what is worth it?" he asked gently. "The ambition," she typed. "The sacrifice. Mars. Is it worth the empty houses?" It was the question that had haunted him since he stepped onto the porch. He looked at this brilliant, dying girl who should have been the heir to his empire, who should have been running his companies, but who was instead fading away in a dark room in Pennsylvania. He took her hand, pressing it against his forehead. "No," he whispered, the truth finally dislodging itself from his throat. "Not without this. Not without you. The future is worthless if we destroy the present to get there." Stella blinked, her eyes softening. She typed one last message that night, a message that would become the cornerstone of the rest of his life. Then, build a future where no one has to choose. Take me with you, not as a passenger, but as part of the ship. This was the turning point. The realization that his legacy wasn't the hardware, it was the humanity he could inject into it. In those final weeks, the dynamic shifted. They weren't just bonding. They were working. Stella, fighting through exhaustion, began to dictate a series of principles for the colonization of Mars, not engineering principles, but ethical ones. She wrote about the psychological support needed for colonists, about the need for art and music in the habitats, about the preservation of human connection in the vacuum of space. She was designing the soul of the mission, while her own body withered. Elon absorbed it all, transcribing her thoughts into notebooks, treating her words as sacred texts. He saw her fading. He saw the pauses between breaths growing longer. He saw the way the light in her eyes dimmed a fraction more each day. But he also saw a peace settling over her, a sense of completion. She had met the myth and found a father. She had shown him her mind, and he had validated it. Shutterstock. The agonizing beauty of those days lay in their finiteness. Every cup of coffee Marina brought in, every beep of the monitor, every sunset viewed through the VR headset felt weighted with supreme importance. Elon learned to be still. The man who measured his life in nanoseconds learned to sit for hours watching the rise and fall of a chest, realizing that this fragile, temporary biological rhythm was the most precious energy source in the universe. He realized that for 20 years, he had been trying to save humanity in the abstract, while ignoring the humanity in front of him. The solution to his life's equation wasn't, is less than Tex is greater than. E equals MC2 is less than Tex, is greater than. It was simply being there. It was the terrifying, beautiful, devastating act of witnessing someone else's existence until the very end. He found that he didn't need to be the techno-king to be a hero to her. He just needed to be the dad who sat in the chair and didn't let go of her hand when the darkness started to creep in at the edges of her vision. He was redeeming 20 years of absence with 20 days of absolute presence, pouring a lifetime of love into a vessel that was cracking, desperate to fill her up before she broke. The end, when it finally arrived, was not cinematic. There were no swelling strings or sudden dramatic proclamations. There was only the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator slowing down, the spacing between the beats growing wider and wider, like a train departing a station, until finally there was only silence. In that deafening quiet, the most powerful man in the world felt the floor drop out from under the universe. The machines that had sustained Stella's breathing fell dormant, their job finished, and the sudden absence of their noise was a violence all its own. Elon stood by the window, watching the first flakes of a Pennsylvania snowfall begin to drift down from a slate-gray sky, dusting the dead garden in white. He felt a profound, hollow ache in his chest, a physical manifestation of the space Stella had occupied and then vacated. The agitation that took hold of him in the days following her death was not merely grief. It was a corrosive, acid-like guilt that ate through the steel plating of his resolve. The funeral was held on a wind-swept hill overlooking the valley where Marina had raised her. It was small, private, and excruciatingly ordinary. There were no cameras, no press, no legions of fans waiting for a glimpse of the techno-king. There was only the raw, frozen earth and a casket that looked impossibly small against the vastness of the horizon. As the soil fell onto the wood, Elon felt the crushing weight of the agitation phase of his life script. This was the consequence of 20 years of blindness. This was the bill coming due for every missed birthday, every skipped holiday, every moment he had chosen a board meeting over a bedtime story. He had conquered gravity, but he was being crushed by the weight of regret. The pain was specific and sharp. He realized that he was mourning a stranger. He was mourning a daughter he had known for 6 weeks, a relationship that was a frantic, compressed highlight reel rather than a full-length feature. The what-ifs swarmed him like locusts. What if he had visited 10 years ago? What if he hadn't been so consumed by his own legend? He had traded 20 years of a human life for headlines and stock options, and looking at the fresh grave, the exchange rate seemed devastatingly poor. He retreated into himself. For a week, the man who tweeted incessantly went silent. He sat in Marina's living room, surrounded by Stella's sketches, staring at the walls. The agitation was existential. He had built his entire identity on the premise of saving humanity, of being the species' insurance policy against extinction. But he had failed to save the one human who shared his blood. The hypocrisy choked him. He felt like a fraud, a man shouting about the future while standing in the ashes of his own present. He told Marina he was leaving, that he couldn't bear the ghosts in the house, that he needed to return to the noise of his factories to drown out the silence of his failure. But before he could leave, Marina stopped him. She didn't argue. She simply walked to the bookshelf where Stella's physics textbooks were stacked and pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal. From inside the cover, she retrieved a folded envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges. She handed it to him with a look of fierce, sad determination. "She wrote this with the eye tracker 3 days before you came," Marina said softly. "She told me to give it to you only after she was gone." She knew Elon. She always knew. Elon took the letter, his hands shaking just as they had on the porch weeks ago. He sat on the edge of the porch swing, the cold wind biting at his face, and unfolded the paper. It wasn't handwritten, her hands had failed her by then, but the printout was intimate in its content. "Dear Dad," it began. "If you are reading this, I'm already on my way to the stars. I know you're hurting. I know you're calculating the probability of different outcomes, running simulations in your head where you came back sooner, where you saved me, where we had more time. Stop. The universe doesn't work backwards. And neither do we." Elon felt his breath hitch. It was her voice. Rational, direct, piercing. "I want you to know that I don't feel cheated." The letter continued. "I had 25 years on a beautiful planet. I had a mother who loved me enough for 2 parents. And in the end, I got to meet the man who looked at the sky and saw a destination. I don't want your guilt. Guilt is inefficient fuel. It burns dirty and clogs the engine. I want your vision. But I want you to adjust the trajectory." He read on, tears blurring the sharp black text. Stella wrote about watching him from afar, about the pride she felt seeing his rockets land. But then she pivoted to the solution, the antidote to his agitation. "You talk about making humanity multi-planetary," she wrote. "But humanity isn't just DNA and cargo. It's connection. It's art. It's the way Mom looks at her paintings. It's the way you held my hand when the thunder scared me. If we go to Mars without that, we aren't expanding humanity. We're just spreading our loneliness to a new rock. Don't just build the ship, Dad. Build the reason for going. And please, don't let my death be a black hole that sucks the light out of you. Let it be a gravity assist, a slingshot to send you somewhere new." The letter ended with a request, a specific, tangible directive that offered him a path out of the labyrinth of his grief. "Don't name a building after me. Buildings stay on the ground. Help the ones who are looking up. Help the girls who have the math in their heads but no one to buy them a telescope. Be the father to them that you couldn't be to me. That is how you fix the timeline." Elon lowered the paper. The wind was still cold, but the crushing weight on his chest had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. The agitation, the pain of the problem, was suddenly met with the clarity of the benefit. Stella hadn't just given him absolution. She had given him a mission. She had reframed his grief not as a penalty, but as a power source. He looked out at the gray valley and saw it differently. He saw it not as the place where his daughter ended, but as the launch pad for something that would outlast them both. The transformation was immediate and kinetic. Elon didn't return to his factories to hide. He returned to build. But the blueprint had changed. He sat down with Marina that very night, and together, amidst the ruins of their shared loss, they drafted the charter for the Stella Horizon project. This was the payoff, the high-value benefit that emerged from the tragedy. Elon insisted that this wouldn't be a typical foundation where a billionaire signs a check and walks away to applause. That was the old Elon. The new Elon, forged in the fire of Room 247, designed a program based on connection. The project focused on young women in underprivileged areas who showed aptitude for aerospace engineering and astrophysics. But the core of the program was mentorship. Every scholarship recipient was paired not just with a tutor, but with a senior engineer from SpaceX or NASA, mandated to spend hours a week in direct conversation. Elon himself committed to mentoring a cohort every year. He realized that the benefit here was dual-sided. He was helping these future scientists, yes, but they were also saving him. They were keeping him tethered to the humanity Stella had insisted was vital. The agitation of his loss became the fuel for a new kind of leadership. In board meetings, the man known for his ruthless efficiency began to ask different questions. Instead of just asking, "Is it faster?" or "Is it cheaper?" he began to ask, "Is it human?" He mandated that the design for the Mars colony habitats be overhauled to include not just survival systems, but communal spaces, art galleries, and gardens, the Stella protocols. They were called internally. He argued with his finance team that the mental health of the colonists was as critical as the oxygen scrubbers. He was no longer just building a transport system. He was building a home, honoring the daughter who had never left her room but had dreamed of worlds she would never touch. The ultimate payoff, however, came 2 years later. It was a moment of quiet triumph that brought the narrative arc to its emotional zenith. On a clear, crisp morning at the launch facility in Texas, the next-generation Starship stood towering on the pad, gleaming in the sun. It was the largest flying object ever built by human hands, a skyscraper capable of breaking orbit. But it was the paint on the fuselage that caught the light. Elon stood at the base of the rocket, Marina beside him. She was no longer the hidden ex-girlfriend. She was his partner in legacy, the co-architect of this new chapter. They looked up at the lettering stenciled in bold, defiant black against the stainless steel hull. It didn't say Enterprise. It didn't say Voyager. It read, The Stella. Underneath the name, in smaller script, was a line from her letter. To the stars, with love. This was the resolution to the agitation. The pain of her death had not vanished. Grief, Elon learned, is a chronic condition, not a curable disease, but it had been repurposed. The ship wasn't just a machine. It was a reliquary. It was a promise kept. As the engines ignited, sending a shockwave through the ground that vibrated in their bones, Elon didn't look at the telemetry data on his screen. He didn't look at the investors or the press. He looked at Marina. And then he looked up, shielding his eyes against the blinding brilliance of the exhaust plume. As the rocket climbed, punching a hole through the blue sky and rising toward the vacuum of space, Elon felt a sense of peace that no billions could purchase. He realized that Stella was finally flying. She was no longer trapped in a broken body or a dark room. She was riding the fire, ascending to the place she had always belonged. And down here, on the ground, the father who had missed her life was finally living the lesson she had died to teach him. That the only way to truly conquer the distance between people is not with speed, but with love. The agitation of his failure had been composted into the soil of a legacy that would grow far beyond his own lifetime. He had lost a daughter, but he had found his humanity. And as the Stella disappeared into the upper atmosphere, becoming a new star in the daylight sky, Elon Musk smiled a genuine, broken, beautiful smile, knowing that this time he hadn't missed the moment. He was right there, exactly where he needed to be. This narrative serves as a devastatingly beautiful reminder that our true legacy is never etched in stainless steel or measured in stock valuations. It is carved into the hearts of the people we prioritize. We often deceive ourselves into thinking we have infinite time to mend broken bridges or make that difficult phone call, forgetting that time is the only non-renewable resource in the universe. Do not let your own story be defined by the silence of words left unspoken or the weight of unopened doors. If Stella's legacy has shifted something within your spirit, I invite you to subscribe to this channel not just to watch, but to join a collective committed to the radical idea that success is meaningless without connection. Share this video with someone you have drifted from, and let it be the signal that guides you back to them before the timeline runs out. Click the like button if you believe that love is the only thing truly worth building. We spend our lives gazing upward, obsessed with the altitude of our achievements, often forgetting that the most significant universe we will ever explore exists within the people right beside us. Elon conquered gravity, yet he learned too late that the most difficult distance to bridge is the silence between two hearts. Do not wait for a tragedy to clarify your priorities. The rockets can always wait, but the people cannot. I am your name, and I thank you for spending your most precious asset, your time, with us today. Click the video appearing on your screen now to witness another journey of lost souls finally finding their way home.